Okay, this is the last unit, Unit 10, in preparation for U.S. History Test, EOCT, End of Course Test. Unit 10 covers Standard 25, the last standard. Changing political ideologies from Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush. We're going to include President Richard Nixon in this in our standards. But Standard 25 is going to be the last standard. And we've been doing the language of the standard since day one in this class. So let's get on to Standard 25. Here it is. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 substandards here. And the stem up here at the top, the student will describe changes in national politics since 1968. So let's go ahead and start A, 25, Standard 25, Substandard A. Describe President Richard M. Nixon's opening of China, his resignation due to Watergate Scandal, changing attitudes toward government, and the presidency of Gerald Ford. Okay, so we're talking about President Richard Nixon here, and our elements are President Richard Nixon's opening of China, Watergate. We could add some other things here. Let's see. Attitudes toward government. We're talking about the citizens' attitude toward government. Alright, so we have here the themes: U.S. role in world affairs, conflict and compromise, is conservatism, and political and social interactions. And so those are the things we'll be looking at as themes. Let's see. Alright, so we're talking about Richard Nixon here. We've talked about Richard Nixon before. He's the presidential candidate in 1968 that profited or benefited from the Democratic National Convention violence that was shown on TV, where the anti-Vietnam War protesters were fighting against the Chicago police. And he's going to win in 1968. And the first thing he does internationally is he goes against the Cold War containment policy. He's going to open up China for trade and for friendship with the United States. In the containment policy, part of that we talked about during the Cold War in Unit 8. In the 1950s, China fell to communism. The United States didn't like that because their containment policy was to try to stop the spread of communism. And we talked about the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism there. And so here China falls to communism, rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy. We talked about all the Red Scare of the 1950s. So the United States is very much opposed to China and did not recognize the communist government under Mao Zedong here. And they really appreciated Chiang Kai-shek, and they put a lot of faith behind him and wanted him to be in there, but he was ousted by Mao Zedong. And the communist leader of China in 1949-1950 was Mao Zedong. And in the 1972, he was the ruler of China. And here's China on the map here. And the United States for 25 years did not visit China, did not have any diplomatic relations with them, anything, because they were communist. Well, Richard Nixon changes this in his policy that became known as détente. In other words, he opens up friendly relationships with China to release tensions during the Cold War. Nixon really wants to bring this Cold War thing to an end, and he sought to use diplomacy rather than intimidation with China, and he's going to ease tensions. He's going to be the first president during the Cold War to go to China and visit with Mao Zedong. Let's change his last name here. Alright, and he was the first to recognize the communist government of China, the People's Republic of China, open an exchange of culture and trade between the United States and China. And he gets high marks for doing this in his administration, so he gets really good international relations marks as President of the United States. He opens China up to trade and cultural exchanges between the United States and China, Mao Zedong, the United States. Alright, and he visits there. Here he is visiting the Great Wall of China. He's talking to the leader, Mao Zedong there. Here he is getting off the plane. Alright, he also shocks the United States when he's the first president during the Cold War to visit United Soviet Socialist Republic, or the Soviet Union, who was also communist. and he met with the Secretary General of the Communist Party, who was previously the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, and they work out this a deal together to work with one another, be friendly with one another. All this is part of détente policy, which is a move away from the Cold War containment type of thing. He's using diplomacy here. They agree to work on some space things together, but the biggest of all, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT. They both agree to lessen the number of nuclear warheads they have available to try to keep from, annihilating the human race from the earth if there was one. So he opens up good relations with China, and a lot of people said he used it as leverage to get into Moscow. But at any rate, he opens up Moscow to negotiations and peaceful talks. And for that and international affairs there in Moscow, he gets very high marks as a good president. It's in his domestic area, this Watergate thing, because we're supposed to talk about Watergate, that he fails to get high marks. He gets low marks, actually. So Watergate is a hotel complex, a complex and hotel. There's office buildings in Washington, D.C. In 1971 is completed. In 1971-72, a lot of politicians and all were trying to put their offices in the Watergate conference buildings, and it was also a hotel for people to stay in Washington, D.C. But at the Watergate complex, the Democratic National Committee had its headquarters in this building, and I think it was the 6th floor of this building here, and the Democratic National Committee was located there, and it was home to the Democratic Party that was trying to get a Democratic candidate for president elected, and it was George McGovern here. George McGovern, they wanted to be president. And at the Watergate building here, inside of this office, 5 burglars were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. at the Watergate Complex building where the Democratic National Committee headquarters was. And this guy here, Frank Willis, actually saw some tape holding the door open near the basement area. And Frank Wills is from Savannah, Georgia. He was a Watergate security guard. He discovered the tape doors and alerted the D.C. police. And these 5 men, the police got there and found them hiding behind the secretary's desk inside of this Democratic National Committee office. They were all hiding in there. Now, when it first broke out, the news first broke out, these were just 5 regular burglars breaking in there. But a little digging by journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in the Washington Post uncovered a connection with the Nixon White House. And they found, after digging a little, that this guy here, E. Howard Hunt, was on the committee to re-elect the president. They later had the acronym CREEP, CREEP, Committee to Re-elect President. They wanted to re-elect President Nixon. They were a Republican organization. And E. Howard Hunt paid money to all these 5 men to break into the Democratic National Committee office. He paid them money, and all of these people had connections. E. Howard Hunt worked with Bernard Baker together in the CIA, and Eugenio Martinez and Frank Sturgis had connections with the CIA as well. They were anti-Castro Cubans, all 4 of these guys here. Frank McCord had worked for the CIA and the FBI, and he paid these 5 men to break in. And what they were going to do inside this Democratic National Committee headquarters and go into the conference room there, and they were going to set up wiretapping devices in the phones and under the desks, and I guess in the filing cabinets as well. But they were doing wiretapping and bugging of the office, and the reason why is to find what strategies the Democrats were going to use to help McGovern win, so that Richard Nixon and his campaign could do some twisting and turning and some flipping to try to make it where President Nixon wins. So they were digging up dirt to use against McGovern, but also trying to find ways they can spin out of trouble. And so that's why they were tapping the phones and bugging the office. These 5 men were doing that, and this guy was paying them. And here's James McCord, one of the 5 burglars, who is demonstrating to Congress a bugging device that was put in the phone there in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex there. Okay, and they were trying to get some information on McGovern and his campaign strategy so they could defeat him. George McGovern was a Democrat. Richard Nixon was a Republican. And so the connection was made that some of Nixon's White House aides, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman here, and another guy, Gordon Straitman, was a Nixon campaign aide, trying to get him elected. They were connected with these 5 men and with E. Howard Hunt. And so there was a connection with the White House and the White House aides. Now, it is still a mystery. Did Nixon know about it? Did he try to cover it up once he found out? Did he order these men to try to cover it up? And nobody really knows, but his administration was connected to the break-in. And so in the Washington Post said Nixon denied his role, said he had anything to do with it, said it was his subordinates, these men here, that did it. And people started accusing Nixon of being a crook. A lot of people called for him to be impeached. And President Nixon went on national television and made this statement here.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
He said, I've earned everything I've got, and he said he's not a crook. He wasn't involved in this, and people still wanted him impeached, still thought he was involved in it. And then the Senate committee, United States Senate, formed a committee to investigate this Watergate scandal, and they subpoenaed President Richard Nixon to turn over his White House tapes. President Nixon used these little tapes like this and record like this to record all his conversations with anybody who called the White House. And President Nixon refused and claimed that he had executive privilege. He was president of the United States. It was a matter of national security what was on these tapes, that he didn't have to do it because of separation of powers. The presidential branch was different than the Supreme Court and Congress, so the Senate and Supreme Court could not make him turn over his tapes. Well, the issue went before the Supreme Court to see if the Senate Committee on Watergate could force him to turn over the tapes. And in U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court said that President Nixon could not use those powers to get away from criminal charges or impeachment charges. So they told him he had to turn over the tapes. And here's President Nixon here on August 29, 1974, where he released edited White House tapes. He tried to release some edited ones to the Senate Committee on Watergate, and then they come back and said, no, we don't want edited, we want the full tapes with everything in them. And so finally, President Nixon turned over the tapes, and over 18 minutes were missing from the recordings. And then he resigned from office shortly after on August 9, 1974, becoming the first president to resign from office. Here's part of his speech.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
So before he could be impeached, he resigned from office. Now, what do we get from all this? Why are we studying this part of it? If we look here on our stances, describe President Richard Nixon's opening of China, we did that. His resignation due to Watergate scandal, we just did that. His changing attitudes toward government, just what I'm getting to here, and then the presidency of Gerald Ford. So how did all this Watergate stuff, how did it change the attitudes toward government by the citizens of the United States? Okay, so here's how we're changing attitudes toward government. They were becoming negative. Citizens say, yes, you are a crook. A lot of Washington people are crooks. So the Watergate scandal resulted in a decrease in trust. People started to mistrust government in America, and they thought that a lot of politicians were crooked. And so that begins the citizens of the United States start thinking that all politicians are crooked. And so that's the changing attitudes toward government. So if we look at this here, and we see that the cover-up and the connection between the Watergate break-in and Nixon's administration was the cause of the Watergate scandal. And then the effect of that scandal was that President Nixon became the first president in U.S. history to resign, and then U.S. citizens lost trust in government, started to mistrust the United States government officials. Okay, and I do believe that that is close to presidency of Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford became president. He actually became vice president when President Nixon's vice president Spiritu Agnew had to resign from office. Gerald Ford was the Speaker of the House, and Nixon chose him to be vice president, and the Senate approved. And then, after Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes president of the United States, because the Constitution says something happens to the president, vice president becomes president. So President Gerald Ford became president, even though he was never elected as vice president or president. And then he runs again in 1976 and loses to Jimmy Carter. Okay, and part of the reason for that, his administration was really derailed because of what he did with the Watergate scandal and President Nixon. Here he is here. He granted a pardon to President Nixon for Watergate immediately after becoming president.
I, Gerald R. Ford, have granted a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
He also pardoned Vietnam War draft dodgers, and so that kind of ruined his presidency, and he wasn't reelected for another term. He was beaten by Jimmy Carter. So with that, I think we've met this standard. Let's see. Describe President Richard M. Nixon's opening of China, resignation due to the Watergate scandal, changing attitudes toward government, and the presidency of Gerald Ford. Good luck on the quiz, the test, EOCT.